Hello everyone, welcome to a new list video where I'm finally gonna be talking about one of my favorite artists in power electronics and death industrial, Atrax Morgue. Atrax Morgue is in my opinion one of the most significant and one of the most essential artists when it comes to power electronics and death industrial. His sound can definitely not be for everyone, and he had a pretty unique approach on how he would handle his themes and his music. He's not really that much known into making hard stuff, so for those who are looking more into some more atmospheric stuff when it comes to power electronics and death industrial, then it can definitely be easier for you to digest. But also Atrax Morgue has managed to create some of the most effectively disturbing albums that genres have to offer. And it's this sincerity that there is with his works, like they feel so sincere in the themes and the subjects that he would approach. Marco Corbelli made a huge exploration on death and had an obsession with what means to be dead, what means to feel pain. It was the main recurring theme that you would see with almost every single one of the albums that he would make. This obsession and curiosity ended up leading to his own suicide in a pretty young age, which obviously makes his works that much harder to sit through. Atrax Morgue is, in my opinion, one of the very few occasions where I would see an artist being so effective on creating such morbid and genuinely disturbing releases that feel personal. And it's just the overall atmosphere that he would create that I haven't really managed to find in another artist managing to recreate. He was a one-of-a-kind artist that had a pretty huge catalogue, and out of it I decided to pick the 10 albums that I personally like the most. Now obviously this is gonna be just my opinion, but these are the 10 albums that I recommend the most and the ones that I see myself coming back to the most. So we're starting at number 10 with Basic Autopsy Procedure. Now, this is one of the rare occasions where we see an Atrax Morgue album that is just instrumental. There are no vocals to it, and when it comes to Atrax Morgue works, the vocals is certainly one of the most detrimental parts in his albums, which is non-existent here, so this might throw some people off. If you are familiar with other albums of Atrax Morgue, this might not be that much to your liking because the vocals is certainly one of the most significant parts when it comes to his albums, but in my opinion this ends up containing some of the greatest instrumentals I've heard Atrax Morgue create. It keeps this very sinister and minimal feel that it might feel like it's slightly dragging towards the end, but the first part is, in my opinion, one of the best tracks that I've ever heard from Atrax Morgue. It is extremely minimal, so on point, and it simply works amazingly on creating this dark and isolating feel that in my opinion makes for some of the most effective occurring themes in Atrax Morgue works. So Basic Autopsy Procedure might lack the vocals, but it still contains some pretty cool instrumentals in my opinion. Number 9 is Lesson 22, which for me contains many of the elements that would make the Atrax Morgue work shine. It is an extremely powerful and dark album with some haunting instrumentals and definitely some of the weirdest and the most disturbing vocals when it comes to the use of effects, when it comes to the way they're played out, the way they're mixed. It's definitely one of those albums of Atrax Morgue that makes you feel sort of vulnerable, and the overall atmosphere is simply effective over here. It's not higher to the list because when it comes to the second half, I think that it doesn't contain some of its strongest elements, but when it comes to the first half, I believe that it contains some of the best tracks that I've heard from Atrax Morgue in general. It is a really good album. Number 8 is the album Death Show that he made as Murder Machine. Now, this is one of those albums that goes the most straightforward when it comes to the death industrial direction, in a way that definitely feels slightly different compared to what we're used to when it comes to Atrax Morgue works. This is possibly one of the easiest albums to get into in his catalogue, which depends on who you ask obviously, because this is still a pretty disturbing album. However, this one goes more into some pure and raw death industrial directions, and I can definitely see why for lots of people it is considered an essential when it comes to death industrial music. It is a really good album on what it does. Now, the second half might have some tracks that are way too minimal, with not really that much to offer. However, overall, yeah, this is a pretty solid death industrial release that, even if you are not familiar with Atrax Morgue, I believe that this is a pretty good starting point. New York Reaper was one of the earlier Atrax Morgue releases, back when his sound was not really that much well fleshed out and he wouldn't really find his own sound, but this somewhat changed with New York Reaper, as it was one of the first albums finally finding his sound, his identity, and this was basically a sound that he kept up repeating and repeating for a very long time. And in my opinion, New York Reaper is definitely one of the best, if not the best, earlier work release. Weird, intense and disturbing album that I'd even say felt slightly ahead of its time. Mechanic's Fixa is more of a personal favorite of mine, but not an album that I can easily see recommending to you, as it's by far one of the most minimal works out of Atrax Morgue, which for me, it is the sound that I like the most. I like when it has those just ridiculously minimal sine waves, that it's just the same frequency over and over again, only for them to be interrupted with vocals. I'd say that in this album we get some of his most sincere and some of his most disturbing and devastating performances. It is an album that is brutal when it comes to the vocals, but the overall sound and atmosphere has this ridiculous minimal sense to the point where it just manages to feel completely isolating, and I really like this part about the album, but I can definitely see why people who would like some more variety to their noise might not find this album that much appealing. At number 5, Spekko Synthetics feels like one of the weirder albums of Atrax Morgue, especially at this point in his career. It was a bit of a more messy release, toying a bit more with free improvised parts, but it still had the Atrax Morgue identity. It had the sound and the minimalism that you would find in his releases, and some pretty disturbing vocals. Another one of those albums, like with Mechanic's Fixa, that I believe is pretty underrated. People would not usually talk about this album when it comes to Atrax Morgue releases, but in my opinion it's worth giving it a shot. Even if it won't become one of your favorites, I believe that it's definitely one of the more interesting releases when it comes to the sound of Atrax Morgue. At number 4 I have the album Autherotic Death. This is another one of those occasions where we basically have an album that is completely instrumental. Once again, I can definitely get it if you can't get into this album, because the vocals of Atrax Morgue is definitely one of the most significant parts when it comes to his sound. However, this is another case for me, like with basic Autopsy procedure, where we get some extremely good instrumentals over here, but it's even greater over here. This contains some of the best instrumentals Atrax Morgue has ever created. It is a really nice combination of minimalism but with some really crazy and out there parts when it comes to free improvisation, and I believe that it's a pretty imaginative work that makes it one of the most underrated releases of Atrax Morgue. Definitely not for everyone, but I believe that the instrumentals over here are certainly one of a kind and some of the best that I've heard of Atrax Morgue in general. At number 3 is Closed Exit, an album that I ended up actually listening to very recently, just a few days or weeks ago before making this video, but it has instantly become one of my favorites. This is one of the sounds that I'm looking forward to the most when it comes to Atrax Morgue releases. Just a ridiculous amount of minimalism, an atmosphere that would just be extremely dark and haunting, and some really passionate and genuinely disturbing vocals. This album definitely delivers. Now, this is another occasion where I believe that you can actually easily get into this album if you want to get into Atrax Morgue's music, because weirdly enough, some of the stuff over here end up feeling sort of more melodic. Like the second track sort of feels like a more happy track. It doesn't really feel like that much of an Atrax Morgue song, and I like that disconnect that it creates at times, as it can be somewhat melodic and be much more atmospheric, to the point where even for Atrax Morgue standards it might feel way too soothing. So at the end of the day, even if we're talking about another standard Marco Corbelli release, I'd say that it's pretty interesting how this one just does more by providing less. It is a pretty weird feeling that you get while listening to this album, and this is why for me this was certainly in just a short time such an exceptional release and one of my favorites. Number 2 is Death Orgasm Connector. Now this one is one of the final releases, one of the latest ones that he did back in the 2000s, and it was at this point where you would basically see a lot of familiarity with the sounds and the approaches, so some of the releases ended up feeling more like recycled material and just providing more and more of the same. There was not like something more keeping you hooked with the releases. But then there was Death Orgasm Connector, which in my opinion took many of the elements that would make his overall sound so disturbing and so unique and just created what I'd say is, in my opinion, some of the most aggressive and some of the most messed up stuff that we've ever heard in a release of his. It's also worth noting that this release in particular is extremely loud. Usually when it comes to Marco Corbelli releases, they're not known to be this intense or having such loud mixing. This one is an exception. This is an extremely loud album. So even if it is atmospheric, get into this one knowing that the mixing is like way too high. And I say that it definitely works for some of the more aggressive and intense stuff that we're listening over here. This is one of the greatest showcases where we see the deteriorating state of Marco Corbelli. We're listening to him being possibly at his most vulnerable state, and it's pretty concerning album. It is really hard to sit through. I like the variety with instrumentals provided over here, but it's also still one of his most minimal works. Like some of the tracks over here are just extremely minimal, like there's not a lot going to them, like at all. And I'd say that it's a really intriguing and interesting release that even if it's not that easy to sit through, I believe it's one of the essentials when it comes to the overall catalogue of Atrax Morgue. And finally we have at number 1 what I would consider to be the greatest Atrax Morgue release, and that is Last of a Maniac. Honestly, this album basically contains everything that is appealing out of the sound of Atrax Morgue. It is all packaged in this one. This is one of the longer releases, as Atrax Morgue was mostly known for making some pretty short albums that wouldn't really extend that much over the 30-minute mark, but this one had a lot of material to it, and not really lengthy tracks, just really short ones that would just end up providing more of a variety to the album. It has everything to it. At times it is minimal, at other times it is really messy and chaotic. I believe that it contains some of the greatest vocal inflections out of any Atrax Morgue album. Like in some of the tracks over here, it was even hard for me to recognize whether we're talking about an instrument or vocals. And also for me, this was the most effective work on managing to be such an isolating, such a messed up, and such a haunting experience. This is an extremely unique album and by far one of the best when it comes to power electronics and death industrial in general that I've ever heard. And I haven't really heard anything else like this that would make me feel this way. Even with previous Atrax Morgue releases, while they have managed to come close, this one definitely extends for me. This was for me the pinnacle of his career, the album that influenced and got into me the most. It is really effective on being messed up, and I haven't really heard many albums that would manage to come close to something similar like this. Genuinely one of the most disturbing and one of the most horrifying musical experiences that I've ever had. Last of a Maniac for me is one of a kind project and definitely one of the best that I've heard in this whole scene. And this is my top 10 with my favorite Atrax Morgue albums. What are your favorite Atrax Morgue releases? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.